Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
You know, it's kind of a Chinese curse, isn't it? May you live in interesting times. Well, living in interesting times is not so bad. I think perhaps we are living in dangerous times. I don't think anybody, regardless of how fanatical, wants to hit a button and start the Third World War. But it is a tricky time. Russia has warned of real war. Not a phony war, a real war, as the country is expected to face an ultimatum from the G7 nations following the US airstrikes on a government airbase in Syria. Russia's UK embassy asked followers online, maybe that's the new paradigm. You know, you don't go to war until you get your followers online who gives you the thumbs up. Anyway, the Russian embassy asked followers online how much they trusted President Trump and UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson to command in a real war. I don't know whether that amounts to a threat or not. How would you trust these people, they argue, in a real war? This is as the G7 ministers prepare to meet to discuss the situation in Syria. I'm just scanning down here. I can't see any mention of the United Nations. Again, I say, what a useless bunch of people they are. Dr. John Bruni from Sage International, a man who knows all about these things. John, thank you for talking with us. Have you ever known a more tricky or dangerous time than this?
No, actually, I've got to say that this is a pretty tricky time, Jeremy. One of the things that I think your listeners are very well aware of at the moment is that if we look at just Syria, and we have to actually take a little trip internationally, because of course we've got closer to home our little friends up in North Korea that are starting to make some trouble for us.
That too.
But if we go back to Syria itself is a crowded, congested battle space. You've got Russians, you've got Iranians, you've got Southern Lebanese Hezbollah. You have got the Americans on the ground. I mean, they've got about 800 military advisors on the ground in Syria trying to give military advice to Arab rebels as well as the Kurdish rebels.
Is the Islamic State in there as well?
Oh, the Islamic State is in there as well. They've got their capital in Raqqa, which is a Syrian city that they had taken over and have occupied. So, look, it's interesting. I've been giving this a lot of thought. And really, when you take the grand sweep of history and you look at, say, something like World War I, World War I was triggered by the assassination of the Austrian Archduke, right? So, it was a gentler time, though, because you could sort of think, okay, one person's assassination. Yep, he was an important guy, he was a dignitary, but it was kind of like not what we're seeing right now. What we're seeing right now, I think, is almost unprecedented. I mean, even if we go back to many of the listeners would remember the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, it was gentlemanly in comparison. And yes, we had the boogeyman of nuclear war standing over our shoulders, but in the end, Khrushchev and Kennedy were rational people, and even though they were at loggerheads, they managed to pull everything back at the last minute. And yes, it could have gone pear-shaped, but the fact is that it didn't. Now, if we then look at Syria, and you've got all these contending factions on the ground, none of them has any incentive to do anything other than kill and destroy. The government of Bashar al-Assad, he's basically in charge of a minority called the Alawites. They're a religious sect which is a branch of Shiism. They used to be the Untermenschen, the underdogs in the Syrian equation for generations. And because we tend to look at the situation now and we see the Sunni Syrians and say, oh, those poor people. But if you look at it, if you're an Alawite, those poor people were your persecutors. So if they were to get back into Damascus, what do you think is going to happen to the Alawites and all the people like the Christians and the Druze in Syria who were supporting Bashar al-Assad? Because they thought that if the Sunni rebels were to take over, especially some of the more extremist ones, they'd end up at the front end of a genocide. So that's why the hatred and the fighting is so intense, because everyone has everything to lose, and that's it.
What do we do with this powder keg that we're sitting on? Why do we have the United Nations if they are totally impotent?
That's a very good question. Look, the United Nations is impotent because basically it's a sign of the times. If we look around the world, there is not one statesman that can get up and do much with anything, whether it's a nation state or whether it's in the United Nations or any other diplomatic sort of entity. This is a problem that we have in the West. I think that a lot of people would sit back and say, oh, well, yes, but we've got Vladimir Putin because he knows what to do. And, I know it seems like a very cynical thing for many people to say, but that's because they're saying that because in the West, in our country in particular, but also in the United States and elsewhere, there is no talent that we can see. There are no Churchills anymore. There are no people of that caliber that will be able to lead their nation to a good place. We have technocrats, bureaucrats, retired unionists, all these kind of guys. And, they have their purpose. They serve their role. I'm not berating them.
Is it
but
leadership?
When you only have them,
is it leadership or is it wisdom or charisma or what is it that these people lack?
Everything, basically, all of the above. I mean, unfortunately, when you're used to running committees in a very low-rent kind of fashion, once you become Prime Minister, you do the same thing. You basically take that sort of equation and run with it at that strategic level, which is not really good. You need to have the ability to, touch the people, move the people, mobilize the people, especially in matters of war and peace. And then you've got, the other end of the equation. We've got someone like Donald Trump. I don't know whether or not anyone wants to be moved by him. The only good thing I can honestly say now about what has happened in Syria is that everyone is running around saying, oh, but he actually listened to his military advisors and he was proportional. But then that begs the question, Jeremy, where in the Middle East does a proportional military strike stay proportional? It usually spirals out of control at some level. And this is the problem that we're facing now in Syria. Yeah. We don't necessarily have confidence that what Trump and his military advisors thought would happen would happen. Will it actually restrain the Assad regime from using chemical weapons again?
But what can anybody do about it? Because they look at Iraq and they look at Libya and they see when the strong man is removed into that vacuum, God knows what will rush.
And look, this is a debate that we must have. The other interesting thing, I watch a lot of news, sometimes a little bit too much news because that's part of what I do. And the idea of rushing off to conduct some massive humanitarian military intervention in Syria sounds great until you look at the kind of people who would support it. Many of those people say, well, the killing on the ground has to stop, we must do something, and that's great. But when a Western bomb is mistargeted and it ends up in a Syrian hospital and, innocent people die.
And it happens.
Those same people who call for the humanitarian intervention then go against their own government and say, pull out the forces, this is a disaster. What we have to understand is that war is not surgical. War is ugly. When you commit your forces, when you commit the forces of a nation to battle, this is a serious thing. It's not a cartoon shoot-'em-up game. And there are no good consequences. Even good guys can make massive, massive mistakes in order to get rid of the bad guys. And we only have to look at Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya, as you rightly mentioned, to see, for all the best of intentions, we get rid of the bad guys, and look what happens. Open-ended conflicts and even more bad guys that are just waiting to take the top post.
Well, years ago, they had this thing called the League of Nations, and that didn't work. And then that looked after the First World War. Then along came the Second World War, and we've been basically at war one way or the other ever since. So the United Nations, for all of this money that we pour into that organisation, should it not be the conscience and the policeman and the spirit of everything that is good and righteous in the world and the protector of children and women and babies? But it's not. It's just a bloody bureaucracy. Why do we have it?
Well, I suppose it's a case of it's been around so long, what's the alternative? And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but there have been some brave voices who have suggested that perhaps we ought to be reforming the United Nations to become the very thing that you say.
Yes, it should be the policemen. I mean, the blue helmets, I said it the other night, the blue helmets should strike the fear of God into the bad guys. You see a blue helmet and you know you're in trouble, but that doesn't work like that.
Well, no, because then the very people who would probably initially support something like that would turn on the idea by saying, "Oh, but then you've got a global autocracy, and what about the rights of nation states? No nation state would want to have a global COP with that kind of power, because that means Australia's sovereignty is jeopardised if Australia or the Australian government does anything weird, and on that argument goes."
Yeah.
So what we have to do as a people, as a global polity, is actually come up with an idea of, well, what are these things meant to be? The United Nations has been serving a kind of grab bag of idealism, politically correct idealism, I might add, for many a generation now. And quite frankly, it's a tired institution. And what really doesn't make it work at all is the fact that you can't speak with one voice without one of the main nuclear powers, the Big Five in the Security Council, jumping up and down on the others. So therefore, they have the power of veto. Nothing ever gets done.
Well, that's what I was going to say to you. Who would have thought that if you had Russia, China, and America, each with the power to veto anything that came before that Security Council, would anyone imagine that you'd get anything done? Or there'd be any justice or any action that wouldn't be stymied by somebody out of self-interest?
No. Well, I think the history of the United Nations speaks for itself in that department. But I think that the only thing that's kept us from really spiraling out of control, and this is really an ugly truth that we have to actually come to grips with, and that is the nuclear terror. The fact that we can still obliterate the world 5-10 times over with the amount of nuclear weapons that both the Russians and the Americans have, let alone the Chinese, let alone the North Koreans, let alone the Israelis, let alone the British and the French, and the Chinese. Did I say the Chinese? I think I did. That in itself gives us pause for thought. When, the only thing that stands between us and total irrationality is our own extinction. I suppose that makes cooler heads prevail in various crises of the past, but we're no longer in that world. Taking the historic example I used earlier about World War I, it was a gentler time. There were not that many people. The places weren't so polluted and crowded. There were, and awful things happened even then. And now we're looking at a world which is bigger, dirtier, in many ways quite ugly, because all the niceties we got rid of quite some time ago. So now it's all very transactional and very sociopathic in the way that we go about business generally. So the likelihood of something in a multi-layered conflict like Syria, or dare I say, of something really terrible happening in North Korea, if that were to transpire over the next few weeks, something really bad happening it's there, certainly. And we have to take that on board. And I'm hoping that whatever the Turnbull government decides to do or doesn't decide to do, it doesn't act hastily, because I think that Australia can certainly get drawn into a conflict not of its making and obviously not in its interests, because, when the lion roars, namely the United States, we usually follow, we slipstream into its orbit. That's a problem for us, I think.
Yeah, well, when President Trump got underway, I thought people would be very careful of him, because they wouldn't really be too certain as to what he may or may not do. So that kind of, uncertainty, he could be viewed as a bull in a china shop, or somebody who is not used to international diplomacy. And God knows, I mean, he's the commander-in-chief after all. But, this clock that they have called, the doomsday clock. Yeah. Do you think we are moving closer to midnight?
In many instances, I actually do. I think that there are too many crises on too crowded a planet and too many hotheads that are running around eager to pull the button, or not push the button, or pull the trigger. The thing that I have to say, just in defence of the Turnbull government for the moment, and I do say for the moment because, it's already flip-flopped a couple of times with regard to the Syrian imbroglio, but Julie Bishop, I think, is taking a very nuanced approach with regard to what we may or may not commit to the United States, and that's a good thing. That is a good thing. But unfortunately, we have a history here in Australia that when enough American pressure is placed on us, we collapse, and we do what they tell us to do. And that's great when you have a president that you can trust. But as you rightly point out, there are many people who suggest that Donald Trump isn't that sort of president. And in that kind of environment, we could end up in a lot of strife.
In a sense, the isolation that we, for many years, thought we suffered from could be a wonderful buffer. It could be a fantastic protection from everything that goes wrong in the rest of the world.
Tyranny of distance has always served us very well. Unfortunately, now we live in a globalized environment, and that has actually sort of watered that down quite considerably, especially when it comes to non-state groups that seek to do harm to Australia because of the proliferation of technology. I mean, people can do things now that they couldn't do 50 years ago, and that kind of changes the equation slightly. But still, there are many aspects of threat that still are very far removed from Australia because of this tyranny of distance that serves us. So, yes, but then the other thing is that what would also serve us well is sometimes being able to say no to our great and powerful friend when we think that it's not in our national interest doing whatever they tell us to do. But that would require a different sort of debate about national security in this country. We have not had that yet. And I think we're still many years away from actually having that.
Well, out of 10, what sort of marks would you give the Australian government for the way they're handling this current situation?
Well, I can only say that I'm bound by the time because at the moment they seem pretty reasonable. I'd say about 6.5 out of 10.
Yeah.
But that may flip back to about 3 or 4, once sufficient American pressure is placed on Canberra.
Yeah. But the argument that you can't have a leader like Assad gassing his own people. I mean, the idea of good men doing nothing and allowing evil to prevail, somebody had to do something, and Trump did. Mind you, I don't know how 59 cruise missiles only managed to inflict 4 casualties. I find that reasonably interesting.
Well, allegedly the Trump administration had forewarned the Russians.
I think so.
And I'm pretty sure that the Russians had also forewarned their Syrian allies that they better get the hell out of there.
More show than go.
More show than go. There is a philosophy that suggests that the strike, being as proportional as it was not meant to be the prelude of a massive conflict between the United States and Syria, but more a shot across the bows to threaten Assad with, greater levels of American military muscle if he should choose to use chemical weapons again. Now, that, of course, is something that is yet to be tested. One has to understand that the Syrian army is really an Alawite army. And as I said, the Alawites are a minority within Syria. Their forces have been hollowed out during the Syrian civil war. It's gone on for 6 years. There have been desertions in the field of Assad's forces just basically putting their arms down and just saying, I'm not fighting anymore, and actually abandoning their posts. They've got low morale. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, say, for instance, Hezbollah fighters, the terrorists over the border in southern Lebanon, get paid, they get pay and also prestige and perks over and above Syrian soldiers, as do Iranian volunteers, the Basij. So, that actually doesn't do a lot for the Syrian army. So they need to have a way in which they can push the rebels back by themselves. And the only way that they can do that, unfortunately, for us sitting there here watching it, is by using whatever they have in terms of chemical weapons. But we have to also bear in mind, though, Jeremy, chemical weapons is not just it's not just being owned by the Syrian government. There are forces in the rebel camp that also have access to mustard gas and can use improvised explosive devices with chlorine gas as well. So,
God help us.
Yeah,
God help us. Thank you, John. Good to talk to you.
No problem, Jeremy.
Dr. John Bruni from Sage International.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.